Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the School Psychologist Community of Practice Spring 2023. My name is Lauren Bechtel. I'm a program specialist with the El Dorado Charter SELPA, and we are thrilled to offer this opportunity in collaboration with Education for Change Public Schools, one of our charter partners. And I'm joined by co-facilitator Jenny Ortega, who is lead school psychologist for Education for Change Public Schools, who will go ahead and introduce our amazing presenters this afternoon.
Hi, my name is Jenny Ortega, and I'm the lead school psychologist at Education for Change. We're a small charter in Oakland, California. And I had the pleasure of presenting at NASP this year and was also lucky enough to attend a session by Dr. Naglieri and Dr. Otero and Dr. Kelly focused on historically discriminatory assessment practices and the changes our field needs to make. As school psychologists in California, we often receive graduate training that emphasizes the need for considering cultural and linguistic differences. But once we're out in the field, understanding or applying that knowledge can become very confusing. Dr. Naglieri, Dr. Otero, Dr. Kelly have spent decades of their life's work on fair assessment. This is evident through the creation of the CAS-2, the bilingual version of the CAS-2, numerous published research articles, the publication of the Essentials of CAS-2 Assessment, and their continued work as professors in various graduate programs. Dr. Otero conducts research in the areas of cognitive science, clinical psychology, school psychology, and maintains a private practice in neuropsychological assessment. He is bilingual in English and Spanish. Dr. Naglieri is well known for the past theory of intelligence and has created many of the assessment tools that we use, including the NNAT, CAS-2, CEFI, and GAT. And in 2022, he was honored with the NYASP Legends in School Psychology Award. And we are very fortunate today to also have Dr. Kelly. I'm going to actually turn it over to him to introduce himself further and to discuss how this work and collaboration began.
Thank you, Jenny. I much appreciate that. I really want to defer to Dr. Naglieri a little bit, but I am happy to be here and certainly have a conversation. That's what we hope to have today, while Dr. Naglieri, Otero, and myself will be doing some presenting to you. We certainly hope that you will feel comfortable engaging in conversation, asking questions, sharing your thoughts, your perspective. That's really important for us to be able to do that. But just by way of background, I want to greet you from sunny St. Croix in the Virgin Islands. I am currently living and working as a school psychologist in St. Croix. I am a retired school psychologist from New York. I worked in the Long Island school districts for 36 years as a school psychologist, retired back in June of 2022 and didn't think I was going to get right back into school psychology after retirement, but was offered the opportunity to develop some programs in the Virgin Islands. And hey, listen, who can turn down an opportunity to, in your retirement, develop social emotional programs and work with the students and faculty here in the Virgin Islands? So yes, I am down here, but as it came to bear in terms of this presentation itself. So as you heard Jenny say before, Jack Naglieri is a legend within the field of school psychology. Tulio Otero has been involved in the work of developing programs, developing tests, assessments, particularly with bilingual or diverse populations. For me, I'm a school psychologist, but I have been involved at multiple levels, not only at my state level, but at the national level. I had the honor of being president of the National Association of School Psychologists a few years back. And my opportunities to travel around the country and speak with school psychologists and spend time in different school districts really gave me a perspective on the diverse nature of the work that we do as school psychologists. But I have to say to you, this year, working in St. Croix and dealing with a population of students that have been challenged in terms of resources, challenged in terms of poverty, challenged in terms of trauma, have really highlighted the need for us as school psychologists to really be thinking about the work that we do around assessment. So we're hoping to challenge you a little bit today. We're hoping to challenge your practice and your thoughts a little bit today. And I'd like to start out, well, first, let me allow Dr. Naglieri to make some opening remarks. Anything that you want to add, Jack, beyond what I've shared already?
Thanks, John. I think that what is important at this particular point is to get an understanding that what we're going to do today is look at assessment practice from a number of different dimensions. And I think that over the decades that I've been advocating for fair and equitable assessment, I think that this combination that we have today with John, with his expertise in understanding practice and the practice at practice standards and ethical standards and so on, and Tulio with his neuropsychological background, and to have the three of us talk about these issues. And unfortunately, Peter Fastino couldn't be with us today, but what we're really able to do here is to try to look at this issue of assessment practices from different angles and make sure that we cover it in a way that really makes sense, because it takes time and effort to change, and change isn't always easy. And we feel that knowledge is the best motivator for change. And that's, I think, the beauty of what we'll do today.
All right. Well, having said that, let's jump right into it then. So, this is not a presentation on ethics or professional practice, but I do want to start kind of with some, make sure we're all on the same page and talk a little bit about the NASP practice model. Again, we hopefully are all familiar with the practice model. This is a kind of the second rendition of the practice model. Originally came out in 2010, was revised and reaccepted in 2020. We all know, again, hopefully that there are 10 general domains of school psychological practice. And as it relates to today's presentation, when we look at the domain number one, which is data-based decision makers, as school psychologists, really as educators, I really like to think that educators in general, we should be data-based decision makers, meaning that we're looking at data. We're looking at what is the data telling us? What are the needs that are being identified? But as school psychologists, practice model really talks about understanding and utilizing assessment methods as part of our data-based decision making. The next domain we talk about, next slide, Jack, is domain 3, where we talk about academic interventions and instructional supports. Now, we have to be aware of the biological, cultural, and social influences that impact upon the students. I often talk about particularly when I talk about mental health, that kids come into classrooms in their backpacks with a lot more than papers and pencils and books. They bring in their life into the classroom. They bring in their experiences, their cultural experiences, their home experiences, their community experiences. And so as school psychologists, we need to understand all of these influences, particularly as it relates to assessment. Now, I mentioned to you just a moment ago that, yes, I'm living and working in St. Croix. Never having worked or lived here before, one of my primary goals when I first got down here was to spend time understanding the culture, spend time with Crucians, which are the individuals who live on the island, spend time with families, trying to understand the culture, because that was critical for me as a school psychologist to truly understand what I was seeing in the children within the schools themselves. So absolutely understanding that is part of our ethical responsibility. We'll talk about it in a moment. Domain 8 talks about equitable practices for diverse students. And that's what today is going to be all about, equitable practices. We need to understand all of these differences and integrate it into our practice in order to truly make those decisions for students and truly understand the implication for those decisions that we're making based upon the assessments. At the foundation of our work is the understanding that we have to advocate for these practices. Part of our responsibility, not only our professional responsibility, but our ethical responsibility, is to advocate for social justice. That means advocating for change when, in fact, we see the need for change itself. And this is part of the challenge that I mentioned a moment ago. We're going to be challenging you to actually engage in some advocacy work at your own individual level, maybe at the state level, or maybe even at the national level. But advocacy work is part of our foundation. Now, in addition to the practice model, part of our standards are our ethical standards. Once again, those were revised and accepted in 2020. And I like to kind of focus on this very first part. In their words and actions, school psychologists promote fairness and social justice. We don't condone or engage in actions or activities or policies that discriminate against others. Now, here's part of the challenge. Sometimes our assessment practices may actually create discriminatory practices, may create discriminatory situations for certain groups of individuals within the schools. So we have an ethical responsibility in our words and our actions promote fairness and social justice, and we work to correct those situations. That's part of the advocacy work that we have to do, is we work to correct those. Now, what you're doing today is engaging in professional development. That's part of our ethical standards as well. And we remain current on developments, research, and you're going to hear lots of research from Dr. Naglieri. That's part of what I love about Jack's work, is the research that he has put into this. He's just not up here telling us because he thinks this is a good idea or because he's developed these test instruments. Again, you heard about Dr. Otero coming from a neuropsych background. There is research behind the work, and you're going to hear a little bit about some of that research. But engaging in professional development is part of the work we need to be doing. Finally, what's really important is that we realize that it's our responsibility as the school psychologist to be choosing instruments that are fair, that are not only fair, but are valid for the populations we're working with. And so the instrument selection becomes critical. And some of the things we're going to hopefully present to you today will help you in that instrument selection. Now, beyond the standards that we have as school psychologists, there are national standards in terms of educational and psychological testing. The American Educational Research Association, the APA, the National Council on Measurement and Education, all talk about the test user having certain responsibilities for knowing the validity, the evidence that supports for the intended interpretation of scores on tests that they use. What's that really saying? It's incumbent upon us to know we have this responsibility to know this information and know both the positive and potential negative consequences for the tests that we are using. And so again, that's part of what we're going to challenge you with today. So NASP has a number of position statements, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just to highlight for you, there's a recent position statement that was accepted and adopted by NASP that talks about promoting just special education identification and school discipline procedures. And it affirms and validates that diversity, understanding culture, individual difference is critical to avoid any type of unjust or disproportionate identification of certain minority populations, unjust or disproportionate disciplinary practices. That's part of what we need to be looking at, particularly in historically minoritized groups of students. As school psychologists, there's another position statement that talks about assessment, promoting best practice, understanding those measurement standards that I just spoke about, adhering to legal and ethical standards for practice, and selecting and using the most appropriate assessment instruments and techniques. That's part of our responsibility as school psychologists. That we engage in culturally competent practices. I said to you before, one of the first things that I wanted to do was really get to know, I try to practice what we often refer to as cultural humility, understanding we can learn from other cultures. And before we jump in trying to make judgments or try and make recommendations or try and work with certain populations, it's critical that we learn from those cultures. And so part of culturally competent practice is being able to understand things from a particular point of view. Now, again, as a, I'm going to, kind of fully acknowledge my sense of a white male, working with a primarily minoritized population, and the actuality is I'm a minority here because the majority population is Afro-Caribbean here on St. Croix. But understanding once again how that is a critical piece of their culture became an important part of my work. Understanding our culture, our conscious and unconscious biases that exist. And when we write our reports, if there are limitations, if there are factors in the instruments that we've used that potentially could create these unfair or biased type of situations, we need to recognize that in our report itself. And again, as I mentioned, the professional development becomes critical. So, question to maybe more rhetorical at this point in the presentation, but how many of you consider ethical and best practices when you're initiating an assessment case? Do we have our test battery that we just kind of all of us give and it's just our standard battery? Or do you really think about the individual that you're going to be working with and begin to think about what are some of my ethical, what are some of the best practices in creating an assessment battery for these individuals that I'm going to be working with? So hold that in mind, and let me kind of turn it over to, again, my friend Jack Naglieri to talk a little bit about historical practices that we have engaged in as school psychologists.
Thank you, John. I like to start with the big picture, kind of set the stage more or less. And I'm sure that you know that when you do an assessment of a student, a comprehensive assessment, you will change the course of that person's life. And that's not an exaggeration. Now, what do you make your decisions based on? Oftentimes, and really all the time, we do make our decisions based upon instruments that we have and procedures that we have, everything from informal observations through very formal tests. And we do what we've been taught to do because when we were taught it, it seemed that that was, the best thing. Today, we're going to challenge that assumption in a lot of different ways. And I love this quote from Einstein: what is right is not always popular, and what is popular is not always right. We're going to kind of revisit and rethink a lot of things that we've been doing, because equitable assessment can be achieved if we choose tests that measure how well a student thinks to solve problems in a way that's not influenced by how much a student knows. In order to kind of give you an understanding of my own why, so to speak, I'd like to tell you a little bit about my experiences working as a school psychologist in 1975, a couple of years ago. I was working at this school, Champaign Elementary in Bethpage, New York. John and I really, came from that same part of the world. And I did what I was taught to do. I gave a WISC and an achievement test. And I remember thinking, there's a vocabulary test on the WISC and a vocabulary test on the achievement measure. There's an arithmetic word problems on the intelligence test and arithmetic word problems on this achievement measure that I'm giving. And I remember thinking, it doesn't make sense. But I was only 25. What did I know? I was just, starting. When I went to get my PhD in the late 77-ish, and I had the opportunity to work with Alan Kaufman, he talked about the verbal IQ as being influenced by achievement. And that made a lot of sense to me. But what really struck me is when I went to Northern Arizona to be a professor at NAU, and we did some private assessment at this school in Havasu, in the Havasupai school. And I tested a Supai young lady, and I still have the report from 1981 that I wrote and the protocol. And what did I find? That the student had an average performance, or what we would call today nonverbal score, but the verbal score was 52. And I wrote in my report that that score should not be considered an estimate of intelligence because she speaks mostly Supai and very little English. My colleagues at the university were not happy with me. They said, no, Jack, you don't understand. Native Americans, for generations, they live out on the desert. They need to have good spatial skills so their right brains are stronger than their left brains. And they went on and on with all this, intellectualization. And I was very clear with them, no, it's really simple. They don't speak English. And we shouldn't be measuring their intelligence in a way that demands understanding directions, requiring a verbal response, and knowing the content of the test. And of course, those kinds of tests that this young lady had trouble with are still in the most recent version of a WISC. So things haven't changed. But it motivated me to write my first paper on equity in 1982. So for me, this is something I've been doing for a long time. A few years after that, I published my first test, the matrix analogies test, which became renamed the NNAT, and then the NNAT 2 and 3, and more recently, the Naglieri general ability tests. But why do I bring these up? Because these tests are all designed to measure thinking in a way that's not confounded by knowing. And what this provided me was a massive amount of research. I've published many, many studies on tens of thousands of people on all these different tests. And it's convinced me that we can evaluate students in a more valid way. And the key to that is really two-dimensional. One, should measure thinking in a way that's not confounded by knowing. And two, thinking should be defined by brain function. Now, I'm going to help you with this and give a few examples. So here's a great example of a test question that demands thinking. In order to solve the problem, the person looks at these relationships, but you don't need to label anything. You could say it in any language. You could not say it in any language at all to arrive at the answer. Now, here's another question that has the same structure. But of course, you need to know the English words to answer that one. Here's another one with the same structure that demands a little bit of math. What's the answer here? Anybody? 16. Now I'm going to give you one that I think no one will be able to answer. Same structure. Only a person who knows musical notation can answer this one. Does anybody know? If you do, just yell it out. A, yes. So that I should have had my guitar out here, because if I play a C7 and an F chord, and then I play an E7, you could probably hear what that A chord sounds like. I'm going to have to add that to this presentation. Anyway, so I realized that we should measure intelligence in a very different way. That's how I got started on test development. It was really about how to do it better. And in all the tests that these 15 tests that I've published, every single one of them, from the NNAT to the Wechsler nonverbal to the Gamma to the CAS and so on, all of them focus on equitable assessment by measuring intelligence in a way that doesn't demand knowledge. But let's just kind of back up for a second. why do we measure intelligence this way? And I'll tell you something you probably don't know. So Binet created 3 versions of what became his test. The 05, the 08, and the 1911. When Binet created the 1911 scale, he made the decision that the items from the previous version, the 08, that demanded knowledge should be excluded. Terman comes along, and because he thinks intelligence at the highest level is verbal and abstract, he puts all that verbal stuff in to the stamp for Binet. So Terman and Binet had a very different view of how intelligence should be measured. Now, why is that important? Well, Terman had a student, Arthur Otis, of the Otis Lenin. And Otis was the person who was instrumental in the development of the Army Alpha and the Army Beta, the tests used by the US military in World War I. And there was a military examiner who gave those tests, the Army Alpha and the Army Beta. His name was David Wexler. And you could see whose book I made a copy of. You can see Wexler's signature at the top of the Army Mental Test book. The Army Mental Test describes the work of the Army Alpha and Beta. And if you think about the evolution of the Wexler scales, it started with the Army, really a reflection of the Army Alpha, which was verbal and quantitative, and the Beta, which was full performance, which really never made any sense to me. What the heck does that mean? And now we use a similarly confusing nonverbal, which doesn't describe what it is, but just what it isn't. But that's how we got the WISC, that's how we got the COGAT, that's how we got the Otis Lenin, and so on. It all goes back to Terman's influence on measuring intelligence in a way that demands knowledge. Interestingly, in the Wexler Nonverbal, Alan Kaufman wrote a preface to this for me, and I was emphasizing the importance of a total score and de-emphasizing the notion that verbal and nonverbal were different kinds of intelligences, which is often what people believe. Because Wexler never believed that. He saw the so-called performance or the nonverbal as the most sensible way to measure general intelligence for people with limited proficiency in English. And even Wexler's definition, the aggregate or global capacity of the individual to act purposely, think rationally, and deal effectively with his very sexist environment, never talked about different kinds of intelligences. But here's the problem. If you look at the Binet, the WISC, the WJ, even the KBC, the OSAT, and the COGAT, they all demand knowledge. And it always goes back to Terman. If they listened to Binet, all these tests would look very different. Now, just to give you an idea of how absurd this is, in my opinion, I would say the best example of the wrong way to do something. I'm just going to pick on Woodcock here for a second. These aren't the exact sample items. They're similar to them. You can go and look in the actual WJ manuals, but you'll see that this is exactly what is happening. On the cognitive, the ability test of Woodcock is a question, tell me another word for large. Correct answer is a big, gigantic, huge. On Woodcock's achievement test, there are questions, tell me another word for big. Correct answer, large, enormous, what? There's no difference between these. And then there's antonyms on the cognitive and antonyms on the achievement. Some of my special ed friends have told me, yeah, when I test these kids using both of these tests, lots of times the kid said, I did that already. Yes, they did. I think this is wrong, but it's wrong because test content is a reflection of test equity. Now, you've probably heard people say to you, you can use the WISC or this test or that because it doesn't have any test bias. That's not the whole story. According to the standards, test bias and test equity are two different components of test fairness. So that's why I put the two in this yin and yang and in this image on the bottom right of the slide. And the standards make it really clear. If a person has had limited opportunity to learn the content in a test of intelligence, that test may be considered unfair, even if there's no evidence of psychometric test bias. I can tell you, I've sat in many presentations where well-known people have said to audiences, you can give these tests because they're not biased. And when I raise my hand, they never call on me. Evidence of equity is examined by test content, and test content is reflected in the average scores that students get on different tests. So what do we know about the research on equity? Well, I'm going to tell you. This is a collection of studies that I've been able to find, and I keep looking to find everything I can and organize it as it's organized here. You can go to my recent book that I published with my co-authors, Drs. Brias and Kims and Lansdowne. This is actually even a more complete version of what's in that book. But if you look at the top part, these are all the tests that I just showed you that have knowledge in them. And the tests on the bottom have a lot less knowledge. And if you look at the overall average differences, it's really clear. When you take the knowledge out of the measurement of ability, groups don't look that different anymore. And this is really important. APA recognized the impact that psychology and psychologists have had promoting racism and the harms that have been inflicted. And that the image I just showed you is one of the things that the APA apology is really all about. And as the authors of the apology wrote, the data that I showed you of big differences across race and ethnicity really fueled white supremacy. And it goes all the way back again to the psychologists of the early 1900s who supported eugenics. You might not know about this, but you need to. Louis Terman, I already mentioned to you that his view about intelligence really was about verbal. But he predicted that the Stanford Binet would reveal significant racial differences which couldn't be wiped out by any mental culture. His aim was to identify low intelligence children and adults who would be involuntary, institutionalized, and sterilized for the improvement of society. We actually had sterilization laws in this country in many states. Yerkes, who wrote the book on the mental tests, was the president of the American Psychological Association and the leader of the eugenics section of the American Breeders Association Committee on the Inheritance of Mental Traits. He also advocated institutional segregation and sterilization. Lawrence Goodenough was a student of Terman's as well. This article that she wrote always irritates me because it's so offensive. Racial differences in the Stanford Binet. And the title of her table 2 is Distribution of Intelligence Quotients by Racial Stock. This is horrible. And the groups with the lowest average scores Cooper Valley Indians, Southern Negroes, California Negroes, Spanish, Mexicans, and Italians. This is the context that we've lived with. And Ray Cattell of CHC spoke out against race mixing, lobbied to overturn Brown versus Board of Ed. This is an ugly history that we have. And the problem is that, psychologists really fueled racial discrimination and the notion that groups are so different. There was an article in the New York Times just the other day. There was a dispute or an issue about a professor at a university in Pennsylvania, and she started off by saying, "Well, we know that blacks are not as smart as whites," and that's the impact of all of this. And of course, this is the impact. We know that Black children are 1.5 times more likely to be identified as having intellectual disability. I published a paper 20 years ago showing how Black children who got lower verbal IQs and performance IQs were more likely to be identified as having, at the time we called it mental retardation, on the WISC, but when they were given the CAS, they would not have been identified, taking the knowledge out. In our book, we estimate that in the gifted world, so to speak, that there's approximately 1.25 million wonderfully smart, brilliant children of color who are smart enough to be in gifted, but aren't. And a big piece of that is the tools, the intelligence tests that I showed you that yield these big differences. And of course, now we have COVID to deal with. So for me, I would be very concerned about using any intelligence test that demands knowledge, because we don't know how much the knowledge component of that intelligence test reflects the lack of progress due to COVID. That's a scary thought. So what's the practical impact? The test that you choose determines the results that you get, the decisions that you make, and the future of that student. And to just give you one more piece of data, and then I'm going to stop. Is there a way to really test this, not by comparing to the CAS or the NNAT, but to compare performance across race and ethnic groups using the general intelligence model, verbal, nonverbal, and quantitative? And I actually did a study on this using 3 tests that I recently published that were explicitly developed for equitable identification of diverse populations, especially gifted children. And what we did here was create an environment where we could test the student with a verbal test, and it doesn't matter what language the student speaks and knows. Same for quantitative. And I won't go through it. I'll just show you just an example. Basically, verbal concepts test based on pictures. Student needs to find which picture does not represent the verbal concept that the other 5 does. Quantitative test, just simple numbers, but this isn't as important as this. We did 3 research studies and found exactly what I found in the past. The nonverbal test doesn't yield differences, but the verbal test responded the same way. No gender differences, no race or ethnic differences, no parental ed level differences, and the same for the quantitative test. So if you only take a general intelligence approach, If you take out the knowledge out of the instructions, take out the knowledge out of the test content, and you take out the knowledge required for a verbal response, you can get equity.
The other thought that I had, Jack, is that, you clearly show that much of the popular tests that we use go back to the Army Alpha and the Army Beta. They haven't changed very much at all. And it occurred to me that if we would put as much thought in the technology that we're using to assess kids as we do in the selection of our cell phones every other year when the new version comes out, many of us would be in a different place.
Yeah, that's
Because
a good point.
I think of the tests we use as a form of technology, and some are more advanced than others.
Hey, listen, we're going to make the assumption that you're all very familiar with the Larry P case, so we're not going to go into any background or history related to this. But it is very, very important to realize that obviously the Larry P case came from disproportionate identification of Black students. And there was an original prohibited list. And then in 1989, there was a task force that concluded, based upon Larry P, that excluded other tests. Now, I know a question came up a little bit earlier about the CAS-2 and that being added to the list. I'm going to let Jack kind of address that as it relates to California specifically. But what's very, very important to realize is that it appears that when districts are using the CAS-2, it's being challenged not based upon what the CAS-2 is measuring or what the CAS-2 is all about, but more how the CAS-2 is being described in the reports, or unfortunately, sometimes if there's testimony that has to happen in some type of hearing situation. So it's very, very critical to recognize, and that's why I think Jack and Tulio are going to spend some time talking about the CAS-2 and what it really measures. And Brittany, I'm going to go back to what Dr. Naglieri said a moment ago. Your question is a wonderful question. I think we're going to be able to get into some of that. But there was actually the Attorney General in California. I'll let Jack, you kind of address this piece that addresses the use of the CAS within California.
Yeah, interestingly, when the CAS was first published in 1997, LA Unified started using it from then and still does. And because of what it is, because of the way it measures how well a student can think. And I actually gave a talk quite a few in 2017, and this attorney who wrote this opinion was at my session, and she made it really clear that it made sense for the test to be used there. And so I'll just leave that for now, but let's move forward here. Conceptualization based on brain function. I'm going to kick this off and then I'm going to turn it over to Tulio, but here is how we think we should be measuring ability, whatever you want to call it, intelligence, ability, cognitive, whatever. Basic psychological processes. Now, to give you just a little bit of perspective, in 1984, when I first started working on this theory, this test, my colleague JP Das and I said that we were going to approach building a tool very differently than what was done by the Army Alpha and the Army Beta, and all those tests that flowed from that. And the key was that we started with a theory of intelligence, or ability, cognition, whatever you want to call it, based on Luria's understanding of the functional units of the brain. So I'm just going to very briefly describe this and then turn it over to Tulio. So planning is the kind of thinking that is used when you have to figure out how to do something. In other words, strategies. Attention is the kind of thinking that you use to focus and resist distractions. Simultaneous processing is the kind of thinking that you use when you have to kind of pull things together, see things as a whole. You could call it visual spatial, but it doesn't have to be visual. It could be verbal spatial. In fact, we have such a subtest. And successive processing is all about sequencing, tying a shoe, speech articulation. You know, lots of times people say, well, this student has dyslexia because they failed a phonological test. But I say, no, phonological score is a symptom. Successive processing is the cause. Because think about it, when people started talking about phonological, I remember asking Joe Torgerson, so Joe, is it phonological awareness, phonological, what is it that comes after phonological?
Phonological memory, rapid
Yeah.
naming.
All kinds of things, right? And he didn't really give me an answer, right? Because really that activity is really about sequencing of things.
13, 14.
And in order to understand what to do for that student, you need to understand what's driving the difficulty with sounding out the words and all that other stuff. So we'll show you some cases about this. So PASS is the definition of basic psychological processes, but look at what I just did. I just explained to you a sophisticated, powerful, very reliable and valid theory, and I used ordinary words. I'm not making up, fluid this or crystallized that, or, any sexy working this or memory that. Nope, ordinary words. Why does that matter? Because ultimately, the most important person you should tell when you do an evaluation is the student. I learned this in the late 90s with the first case I ever did. This case that I call Frankie, of course, not his real name. I just want to briefly tell you about this. Frankie was a wonderful kid. Teachers loved him. They worked really hard to help him. His father came to me and asked, Jack, will you just do some testing and see what you can find? I said I would. Frankie had a lot of anxiety. He was really struggling. Look at his self-portrait. I mean, that tells you a lot just right there. Anyway, I tested him. What did I find? I found that he was good in planning, good in simultaneous, good in successive, good in math calculation, good in vocabulary, really good. Well, his father's a teacher, his mother's a nurse. There's a lot of good, rich vocabulary going on there. But he had a cognitive weakness in attention. And I sat down with him and explained to him where I found his strengths, because PASS is really a strength-based approach. We use the strengths to manage the weaknesses. And when I told him that his score on the attention test tells me that was really hard for him, he said to me, 11-year-old boy said to me, yeah, that's right. I just can't concentrate. Well, then he said something else to me, really important. He said, so what you're telling me is I'm not stupid. Frankie had an older sister with Downs, so he understood that not everyone's smart. Now, I talked to Frankie's father about a year and a half ago and found out now, he not only did he graduate, went to college, he's married, got kids, he's a successful graphic designer. So he's using his good simultaneous, his good planning, his good successive to manage his weakness. And I often think, what if I didn't tell him that he really was smart? Wouldn't he have thought that he must be stupid? Because most people who don't do well in school think that they're not smart. I'd like to think I helped him. So anyway, Tulio, I'm going to turn it over to you.
I'm reflecting on that Frankie case, Jack, and one of the things that I find very, very useful is, in addition to talking to the student and giving them feedback that is first strength-based, when I am in my multidisciplinary team meetings and I'm reporting back to the teacher and parents and the rest of the team, I'm able to, again, in simple language, describe strengths that the teacher and the parent understand. And the whole mood begins to change from a feeling that my kid or my student is a deficit in some way to, wow, there's these other things we're not paying attention to. So that is one other piece of information that I just wanted to share. I'm sure many of people in our audience do the same thing. I just want everyone to know, like you, I'm seeing kids every day, and I'm very, very busy. And there's some things I will not make time for, but there are things that I do. And one of those things is talking to the kid, the parent, and the teachers about my findings. Okay. Oh, and like you, Jack, what if I never say these things? And I just, give people the scores and go on with my day, not very helpful. And for those of you that have not heard me speak before, you've probably already realized I'm disfluent, and you're going to have to bear with me. Sorry. Okay, next slide. So let's talk a little bit more about planning, okay? You all know about this term, executive function. Planning can be thought of as related to executive function, or you can think of it as executive function or as a component of executive function, but that's basically, in my mind, what it is. It's all about setting goals, making decisions, predicting what to do next or what will come next, not being impulsive. And if you are a little impulsive, do you realize you're impulsive? Put on the brakes, check what you're doing, regroup, move on, okay? So, and it's also about thinking about how to solve any kind of problem, whether it be academic things in your social life, or I don't know, how to change that light bulb in your garage. Okay, it's all about thinking of how do I approach different situations. Next slide.
And Tulio, we should probably add to this slide what Nick Goldberg emphasizes all the time, that planning is most important, executive function is most important in novel situations.
True. Yes. Thank you for adding that. Okay. And this is your case, Jack, right?
Yeah, just very briefly. This is an important case because it illustrates a weakness in planning and also a weakness in successive that's related to dyslexia. So this is a boy who went to a school near where I lived at the time. They were doing a lot of RTI, so they gave him so much support and so much help for his whole first year in first grade, and didn't work, so they retained him. We know that's a bad choice. So the second year in first grade, same kind of problems. Finally, they tested him. What did they find? Strengths and simultaneous inattention, weakness in planning and successive. These are the kids I really worry about, because when they get stuck, they're not really very able to figure out how to get unstuck. So you're going to see this triangle as we go through today. This is the discrepancy consistency method that Tulio and I wrote about in our book. And it's an emphasis on strengths. Weaknesses are on the bottom. And the consistency on the bottom of the triangle answers the question, why student fails. That's a critical question. And then for a case like Rocky, there's plenty of interventions that could be used from my Helping Children Learn book. And especially this one called Planning Facilitation. I'll just run through this real quickly and then turn it back to Tulio. I encourage you to read this paper. You can see it, it's on my website. And I'm just going to give you like the big picture here. This was an intervention study. Teachers did the intervention, which was basically to facilitate discussions with students about how they did the work. In other words, to encourage them to think about what the goal was, how did they approach completing the math worksheets, and so on. The kids provided solutions in a group so the kids would hear what other kids said. And the bottom line is what happened was, after this interaction that the teachers provided, the students who were encouraged to think about how they did what they did improved dramatically on worksheets taken directly from their curriculum. Not only that, the improvements generalized to standardized achievement tests, the Wyatt and the WJ. And in a one-year follow-up, the experimental group was still better than a control group. And and all of these kids were at a school for the children with LD and ADHD. So point just being, we go from changing how we do the assessment, using a theory to define what needs to be measured, finding out what the problem is, and then using an intervention that addresses that problem. So look at what we've done already. We've gone from assessment to intervention. And Tulio,
Sure.
you just did this one the other day, I think, right?
Yeah. This is a very recent case. Just completed it a couple weeks ago. So Carlos is a fifth grader. You can tell by, in quotes, writing is a pain, what he was struggling with. Okay, but there were other things going on. Other than not having good skill in writing, and it was taking him a long time to produce any work, very poor penmanship, very poor mechanics, and would only write very simple ideas. And there is a family history of all kinds of things, of learning disabilities, anxiety, depression. This classroom teacher shared that in larger group, he just looks like he's completely distracted. And then thus he's not comprehending basically what's going on. And he's had an IEP for OT, speech and reading comprehension. Next slide, Jen. So other observations that were made makes careless mistakes in schoolwork. Careless mistakes makes me think, oh, he's really not self-monitoring, not self-checking, things like that. He gets tired easily, or although he's observed to get tired easily, I was also wondering if that was sort of a avoidance type of behavior for him. He'll do anything to avoid having to write. His spelling is poor. Difficulty understanding what he reads, particularly as the sentence becomes more complex, longer paragraphs, things like that. And some difficulty articulating thoughts. He will, in the middle of the sentence, sometimes stop and say, gee, what was I going to say? Type of thing. And he needs to read and reread and reread in order to, if you will, encode information and retain it.
I just want to draw attention, the poor handwriting. That always makes me think of successive processing because of the role of sequencing in motor movements.
Uh,
Do you agree with that?
oh, yeah, yes, and we'll see in the cognitive data that you're correct. The first thing I did, I gave him a RIAS, okay? I did not have to give him anything other than the pass. However, here's why I did it, okay? First of all, this was not a case I did in the school. This is a case from my private practice, okay? And the mother was really concerned because the teachers were communicating to her, your kid's doesn't seem like he's very smart. He's a very nice kid. He's not a behavior problem, but he's just not, making it. Okay. And I find it easier sometimes if I give a traditional test that will just inform them what the general ability level is, and then I can give the CAS to get into some specific processing areas that can explain things better. Number one, okay. Number two, if you look at the RIAS, what do you see? Not much, right? It's pretty much average. For those of you that don't know the RIAS, the CIX is the full scale. The VIX is the verbal IQ. The NIX is nonverbal. The CEM is the composite memory scale. Okay, everything is pretty much doesn't really explain to you, right, why this kid is having so much difficulty. So then I give him the CAS slide and look at what we get. Okay, Jack just mentioned a moment ago, when you see poor planning and poor successive processing, that's reason to be concerned, because it's really difficult for the student to, develop strategies to help them along to better that area of weakness. But he's got a great simultaneous processing, and interestingly, lots of complaints about his attention. On the CAS, the attention did not show up as incredibly poor. It is below average because on the CAS, average is 90 to 109. So just a little below the average. I had collected other information that suggests that there were some issues with attention. They just didn't show up as strong here. So he has a weakness in planning and a weakness in successive processing. Now, let's go to the next slide and compare these things to his achievement scores. So consistent with some of the concerns, poor spelling, poor reading comprehension, calculation was 85. Some people would say that's not a bad score. All right. I guess it depends what school you're in. In the school I'm primarily in, teachers get concerned about that one. Written expression, which is the most difficult area for him, 78. Now, many of you know that to have a good written expression score, what do you need? You need to plan what you're going to say, write it in the correct sequence, apply mechanics, and proper spelling, and so on and so forth. All those things, you need good planning and good successive processing. Okay. Next slide, Jeff. I think there is. So in in programming for this kid, I had enough evidence to suggest Carlos has a specific learning disability. He has cognitive strengths, he has cognitive weaknesses, and the weaknesses can explain those academic weak areas. So there's consistency, there's an explanation. Attention, we all think we know what it is. Attention is quite a complex construct. Jack and I recently acquired a book on the latest research on this topic. It's like 550 pages. So I don't think we all necessarily know really what it is, but we know what it is when we see it, right? And when we don't see it. Okay, so it's a type of thinking that involves attending to something and resisting distractions. So selectively attending to something and ignoring other things. You focus your attention, you sustain it over time, and you can maneuver your attention selectively depending on the salience of what's in the environment, right? What's meaningful, what's drawing your attention, okay? Really listening as opposed to just hearing.
And Tulio, this would be the area that would be weak for a student with an inattentive type of ADHD?
Typically, yes. This is the area you would find for that kind of student. And some students that are not necessarily ADHD, but have difficulty regulating their attention. Either they become hyper-focused and can't shift their attention where they're supposed to, right? So there's a lack of that ebb and flow of flexibility, okay? Or you have kids that present with somewhat of an attentional weakness, but it doesn't reach to a clinical threshold. And one of the tasks that we have on the CAS-2 is the classical Stroop test, okay, where the student has to respond to the color the word is printed in and not the word itself, okay? And the natural tendency is to read the word. And those kids that have a real hard time focusing and sustaining their attention have a hard time just saying the color and not the word. Here's another fifth grader, Jose. He had some rather significant reading problems. There were concerns in the area of phonemic awareness, reading fluency, reading comprehension, math problem solving, spelling, written expression, all over the place, right? He was receiving English language learner services. These are his access scores. His best score is basically in the domain of listening, right? He can listen and respond to conversational English quite well. And writing, he was sort of emerging, all right? The previous psychologist who evaluated this student gave him the WISC-4 in Spanish. You can see, as happens with a lot of these bilingual kids or these non-proficient English learners, a really low VCI, verbal comprehension index quite low, and low average working memory, and the other areas were just average. And here are his academic scores, his pass scores, and our nifty triangle that helps you explain to the parent and to the teacher and to the team what's going on, and helps you to conclude if there is a specific learning disability or there is not. So you can see that he has several low academic areas consistent with the teacher's concern. And then here you have the pass scores. Now, if you think back to the previous slide, all we saw was poor verbal comprehension, very, very poor. And here, what we see is the problem is actually in attention. He has a very low attention score. He's got good planning, good simultaneous processing, and decent successive processing. In this case, I had to do something quick because the teacher was, pleading for help. What can I do with this kid? We don't know what to do. Okay. So what I did was this. I remember when I was in graduate school taking a course in brief therapy or something like that. And I remember the professor saying, pick the intervention, the quickest, smallest thing that will create the biggest result for your client. Okay. And in the Helping Children to Learn book, we have this image, think smart and look at the details. So I sat down, I talked with the kid, I told him how smart he was, and he had difficulty mostly in focusing his attention appropriately throughout the day. So we put this this sign, if you will, on his desk. And I said, keep looking at this throughout the day. Or if you realize you're not attending, look at that. And that will cue you to attend to details. And the teacher reported that there was an increase in his reading accuracy by at least 80%. Okay, in just 3 sessions, just by this one intervention. All right, it seemed simple, but to me it seemed utterly powerful. Okay, and the kid is doing it himself. And of course, as any good school psychologist would do, you check in with the teacher, and sure enough, she says, you know what? I don't have to tell him as many times in a day. Look up at the board, pay attention, look over here, don't look over there, things like that. Okay, so a simple thing that I would have never have thought of. I would not have done this had I not given the cast to and realized that his difficulty was in the domain of attention. Okay, next. Okay, simultaneous processing. It's all about understanding how things fit together, how things come together, relating little bits of pieces of information to a larger idea or to a larger concept, right? And knowing how things fit together, or seeing the big picture before you look at all the details. And this can be related to various academic areas, such as reading comprehension and different kinds of math and understanding verbal concepts. This is one of the an example of a very simple item, but believe me, they get increasingly more complex. One of the things I want to really emphasize, we're talking about planning, attention, simultaneous and successive processing. I want to emphasize that the brain is very complex, and you won't always see that a kid only has one processing weakness. They may have more than one, but also even when they are successful at things, they might be using different processes for different tasks. So, or a different combination of processes for the same task. Okay, so it is very complex, even though we are presenting everything in a very straightforward and simple manner. I just don't want you to assume or believe every time you evaluate a kid with an instrument like this, everything is going to be black and white and very clear. In fact, Jack and I just submitted a paper where we pretty much go into nauseating depth of all the neuropsychological aspects of past theory, okay, where we talk about all the areas of the brain and the networks that are that underlie all of these processes. So be on the lookout for that.
Yeah, I just wanted to just very briefly, this is actually from a paper that Steve Pfeiffer and I wrote, where we found this is a student who has a simultaneous processing weakness. I just want to draw your attention to something on the bottom here. You see this little like spreadsheet. This is a spreadsheet that analyzes the 4 scores, tells you if it's a significant strength or weakness. You can get this on my website. You can't buy anything on my website. Everything's free there, but you can get this. You can also get past score analyzers that compare past scores to achievement, like comparing the CAS scores to the FAR, the FAM, and so on, and any other achievement test that you might be using. Just to illustrate, here's a boy with a really low simultaneous processing score, that and with difficulty with written language, math facts, reading comprehension especially. And so you see it in the results from the FAR, especially with the fluency index. Steve and I have often talked about the fluency piece being related to simultaneous processing.
So successive processing, as we have already mentioned, it's all about keeping information in order, okay? And you can think of, we are using successive processing when we're following steps of a task. When we're doing a word series recall, when we're decoding words, especially those first and second graders that are still struggling with reading. Early reading skills demand a lot of successive processing, okay? But it also, I find, impacts comprehension, okay? So for example, think of math word problems. The kids that I evaluate that are doing well in calculation and not so well on applied concepts and applications, they need some degree of sequential processing to keep track of all those words and discern the essential from non-essential details, and then to translate that into some kind of computation, whether they do it mentally or in written form. Okay, so written comprehension. Okay, also I have observed, and unfortunately we don't have data for this, but the younger kids with poor successive processing may appear to be inattentive, when in reality the issue is successive processing. They can't follow along everything that you're saying and keep it in order, so they look like they're inattentive.
Let me just jump in here for a second, Tulio.
Sure.
So when we measure successive processing, one of the subtests is word series. We say words in order, the child repeats it back. But the other subtest that we have is one where we show the students a series of numbers, and then we take it away and they tell us what that sequence was. the reason I want to draw your attention to that is it's not about modality. Visual and auditory is what we've been taught. What matters is what you have to do with it.
Mhm.
Same thing on the other tests, the other scales. We have tests that have different modalities or different content, but they all measure the same basic psychological process, even though they look different. And remember, this successive processing is going to be the key to identifying a student who has dyslexia.
So remember, the test was developed on a theory of how the brain works. So modality doesn't matter. We are talking about how the brain works. Okay, Gloria. So she was referred for an evaluation after over a year of guided reading with little improvement. Okay. But she's a really sweet, nice girl. She's motivated to do well. She works hard. She's happy when she completes her work, even when it takes her a long time. She never gives up. She does see a speech therapist who's been working with her on correctly pronouncing 3-syllable words and producing the initial sounds of targeted words. And I see that Jack put a note here that item 2 and 3 suggest that she has good planning. And of course, item 4 would suggest probably she's not that strong in successive processing. Okay, and here is the data I have for her. Look at her WISC-5. Doesn't explain much of the academic weaknesses. Look, her letter word ID, 57, reading comp, 53, spelling, 70. Now, when I saw this, I was really incensed of why this kid has been doing reading recovery for a year, when the CAS shows that very low successive process. And this means to me that what she needs is a lot of phonemic awareness, phonological processing help, and so on and so forth. A completely different reading program than reading recovery. She's obviously lacking some very fundamental reading skills, and that is shown, or that correlates very nicely with the low successive processing.
So I have a question for John and Tulio. Given this case, wouldn't it have been important to give the CAS2 brief, the 20-minute CAS2 brief, and instead of waiting a year, working with the kid all that time to find out in 20 minutes that she had such a low successive processing score, and then initiate a more complete evaluation?
I guess, Jack, it would have made sense if the psychologist who did the original WISC-5 earlier would have realized there was the CAS brief. But this.
But is that possible even? Is logistically, can that work, or am I missing something? Like,
well,
kind of permission?
Luckily in my world, okay, and I can only talk about my world in Illinois, I can do anything I want as the school psychologist. Okay, they truly expect me to make the decisions to use whatever instruments I use that will give the information that I need in order to help the team come to better decision making. Okay, I don't think everyone has that luxury. What do you think, John?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And I'll answer it this way, Jack. I think that it goes back to a couple of points that have already come out, but it always bears repeating. One is database decision making. What data was used to place Gloria in that initial program? And so whether we're operating on an RTI type of process, and let me just say, from my perspective, cognitive assessment doesn't it's not mutually exclusive in RTI process. I think in many ways we can go hand in hand, but that's a whole nother conversation that we can have. So, I would ask, what was the data that was used? And there was a quote that was posted a little bit earlier in one of the slides that talked about the instruments that we select have tremendous and profound impact upon the results that we get. And so your question is an excellent one, Jack, in terms of, well, what data was used, what instruments were selected, and look at the outcome here for this. And hey, listen, a year can be an eternity for some students. A year lost of appropriate intervention is critical at young ages. So for me, it goes to the point of the data that we use and the instruments that we use to gather that data.
Right. And I can add that in this particular case, part of the reason that I was incensed, they weren't even using their own data. So yeah, you were giving the kid reading recovery, which is a tier 1 intervention. Everyone gets it. You don't need a specialist to give you it. Showed minimal progress, and you're still giving the kid the same intervention. Makes no sense. Okay, so I think that in this particular situation, no one was even monitoring the data in order to make a better decision of what to do with this girl until I came along and did this evaluation. But she's a year, as you said. Some kids use valuable instructional quality in instructional time, right? Now, I can throw a wrench in this further. There are exclusionary factors, right? When you are at the table deciding if a student has a specific learning disability. In my world, on our sheet, we have to go through what these exclusionary factors are. One of them is lack of appropriate instruction. Okay, I didn't make a big deal that there was a lack of appropriate instruction because this would have disqualified the eligibility. Okay, but it was there, right? but based on this, I knew it was obvious that this kid is SLD, and I'm not going to play around with the district's regulations. Anyway, I'll stop now. Thank you for listening.
So just to summarize the class, this is what we see in terms of dyslexic, evidence of dyslexia, low successive, and academic failure. What are we suggesting here? We're suggesting that you use these PASS scores to determine if a child needs a certain kind of instruction, if they have a disability, and so on. It would be welcomed if someone wrote in the chat box, is there evidence that we can, in fact, interpret those scores? And I think oftentimes we don't ask the critical questions of the presenters. So I'm asking the critical question to us, but I'm going to answer it too. Because this is a really important question. Why is it? Because if you don't know about all this research that's been done by our school psychology colleagues who have repeatedly found that on all the different tests out there, nearly all the different tests out there, the WISC, the WJ, even John Carroll's original work, that when they analyze all these different tests, differential ability scales, the Stanford-Binet, all the different versions of the WISC and so on, what they consistently find is that the only score that should be interpreted is the total score, not the parts, certainly not the subtests, but not even the scales. The only exception to that was this study, and one that will be published shortly, that found that the PASS scores can be interpreted, that the CAS does yield scores that you can interpret. And notice, I'm not talking about subtests. I stopped teaching subtest analysis decades ago. It doesn't work. What these researchers have found consistently is that the only score that should be interpreted on WISC, on a WJ, if you're using a CHC approach or a course battery or whatever, is a total score, except for the CAS. Why is this important? And here's really where it all comes together. This is a table that Tulio and I published a couple of months ago. In this collection of research, we've been able to look at different profiles for students who have autism, dyslexia, and ADHD. And if you look at the WISC, you don't really see anything. You look at the WJ, and you look at basically the same profile. You look at the KBC, and what you see is no specific profile. You look at PASS, and you see specific profiles. Children with ADHD, low in planning or executive function, just like Russell Barkley has been saying for years. Students who have dyslexia, low in successive processing, like the cases we've shown. And in this particular paper where we were talking about children with autism, they have a specific weakness in attention, not because they can't attend, because they can't shift and manage complex attentional environments. So the point just being here that we're suggesting that you use these 4 scores to make really important decisions about children. These 4 scores that we know are equitable, these 4 scores that we know you can in fact interpret, unlike what we've seen for other tests. And there's other information in this handout that you can look at. I also want to point out that you might have noticed I crossed out the full scale in a lot of the cases, because the full scale doesn't make any sense, really. It especially doesn't make any sense if you have variability among the 4. So, because really CAS measures 4 separate abilities. It could have been 4 separate tests. But then that wouldn't have respected the theory, right? Because the theory is a comprehensive theory that holds together.
You know, we did have a last section there because I wanted to bring it back to where we started, and it was all about advocacy. And it was about what we can do. I think that I want to acknowledge the position that you as school psychologists working in California are working under, you know, particularly related to the Larry P case and some of the limitations that are there. I also want to acknowledge that CASP, the California Association of School Psychologists, has been doing their own advocacy work to really challenge some of these limitations that that you are working under. And that while we appreciate, I'll say, the initial intention of Larry P., the actual outcome hasn't changed, unfortunately, the trajectory of many students of color. And, you know, I just pulled from a recent statement from CASP that talked about this complex web of inaction that has led to the disproportionality of African-American students in special education. So I do want to acknowledge, and I think it's really important to recognize that as we talk about equity and assessment, we realize once again what you were working under and the conditions that you're working under, and yet some of the advocacy work that's being done to challenge some of that. I do want to acknowledge, because I really found this an amazing blog post by 2 school psychologists there in California, Marissa Ennis and Maria Gregory. I don't know if they're you know, on the call or you know, in attendance tonight, or if anyone knows them. but they had a wonderful blog post that they had put up that talked about culturally responsive assessment. And again, they acknowledged that, yes, there are limitations that are being placed on school psychologists, but what can we do? What can school psychologists do? And how can they engage in advocacy? And we just don't have time to go through it all right now. But essentially, it's talking about what we do as school psychologists, engaging and making sure we're involved across the tiers, not just at the tier 3 level, but we're advocating for those MTSS systems, and that we know that we can work beyond tier 3 in terms of looking for not always the problem within the student, but sometimes the problem within the school environment. And that's really, really critical. It's something that I'm doing here in St. Croix is not always looking at the problem within the student, but what's happening in the student's environment. I said it at the very beginning, kids are walking into our classrooms with lots of things in their backpacks that have nothing to do with the curriculum that's being taught, nothing to do with the teacher that's standing in front of that class, but everything to do with personal things that happen in their lives. Next slide. Re-examining our tools. That's what we've been talking about here tonight. Make sure we're re-examining our tools. That's an incredible piece for us as school psychologists. Next slide. Knowing your community. I talked about at the very beginning, taking the time to know what is important in our community. What are the parenting styles? What are the values, the attitudes? Making sure we're observing students beyond the classroom. I try and make it a point to observe students outside of the classroom, engaged in all kinds of activities. I think that that's incredibly important. And finally, being able to focus on strengths. I'm going to give a quick shout out to a colleague, a good friend of Jack and mine, Byron McClure and Kelsey Reed. I have no financial stake in their book, but Hacking Deficit Thinking is such an incredible approach. Let's focus on student strengths and not always their weaknesses. Now, one more, Jack, and then we'll get to our final slide of the evening. Using standardized tools to test rather than develop hypotheses. What you heard from Tulio and Jack tonight is approaching our assessment from a perspective of a theory, not just the random group of testing, because we are looking at a variety of different issues. We're approaching our assessments from a theory, and what Jack and Tulio presented us with tonight is approaching it from the past theory perspective. So, challenge for you, hopefully challenge accepted. So you heard a little bit earlier that Jack was honored in the fall of 2022 with the Legends status in school psychology. And this is the way I had the honor of interviewing Jack for his Legends address. He didn't actually do an address. We did more of a kind of reflective conversation on his career and how he got to the point where he's at now. And if you don't know, Jack is a very talented musician. Started his career actually playing gigs in small clubs and made his way through graduate school and by playing gigs. So Jack, I'll let you talk about this last clip that we have here, which concluded our Legends address back in the fall.
Thanks, John. John, I can't thank you enough for all that you did, that especially that day, but all the other days that we've interacted. And as a musician, I've been a musician my whole life, really, and songs kind of touch me. And I listened to a song in a movie recently, and I think the words apply very much to what we're doing here today. And I'll just play this little clip, and I think it'll become obvious.
Maybe it's time to let the old ways die. Maybe it's time to let the old ways die. Takes a lot to change, and it takes a lot to try. Maybe it's time to let the old ways die.
So with that, I'll say it was a real pleasure. Thank you, John and Tulio and Jenny and everybody for being here. Be in touch as needed. We hope to see you again. And don't hesitate to Be in touch.